My name is Nora Callahan, and I am 32 years old. 11 days ago, my parents sat across from me at my own conference table and asked me to make one phone call to a state regulator, the way you'd ask someone to grab the mail on their way inside. My mother had brought a folder, the kind with a soft cardboard cover she buys in packs of 10 from the drugstore in Bellhaven, the same kind she used to keep Daniel's Little League schedule in when we were kids. Inside it, this time, was a letter from the Ohio State Medical Board threatening to suspend the operating license of my brother's clinic. The clinic my parents had funded 3 years earlier by draining $180,000 out of a retirement account my father spent 31 years building, one paycheck at a time, at a grain co-op 2 miles outside town. My mother slid the letter across the polished table like it was a permission slip and said, "You can fix this, right? It's just paperwork." She still believed that, sitting there in her good church coat with her hands folded on top of the folder, waiting for me to already be reaching for my phone. I read the letter twice before I said anything. It was 3 pages, standard formatting, the kind of language I read for a living, a facility out of compliance with a named officer requirement, 30 days to cure, potential suspension pending review. I could have told her, in that first minute, everything she needed to hear. I didn't, not yet, because what she didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to learn in 8 years, was that I had filed the original paperwork myself, alone, at my kitchen table, back when I was 24 and still trying to earn a seat at a table that had never actually been set for me. One line on one form, untouched since the year I wrote it, was the only reason that clinic had ever opened its doors in the first place. It was also, as of 3 weeks before that meeting, the exact reason it was about to close them. Before I take you back to where this really started, if you've ever been the one who did the quiet, unglamorous work while someone else got the ribbon cutting and the toast, I want you to stay with me on this one, because it doesn't end the way you'd expect. Hit subscribe if stories about families and the ledgers they don't know they're keeping mean something to you, and drop a comment telling me what the paperwork looked like in your family, whatever shape it took. I read every one of them. Let me take you back to where I actually grew up, because none of this makes sense without it. Bellhaven, Ohio, population just under 80,400 depending on which sign at the town line you believe, has one working stoplight, a diner called the Wagon Wheel that has served the same meatloaf special since before I was born, and a grain co-op where my father, Frank Callahan, worked the scale house for 31 years, same shift, same steel-toed boots, resoled twice a decade, because he said a new pair never fit right until you'd already ruined the old ones breaking them in. He weighed trucks full of corn and soybeans coming in off the county roads and wrote the tonnage down by hand in a ledger long after the co-op switched over to computers, because he trusted his own handwriting more than he trusted a screen that could crash without warning. My mother, Patricia, played organ at Trinity Lutheran on Sundays and kept the books for 2 small businesses in town the other 6 days, a hardware store and a dentist's office, both of which trusted her completely with numbers that weren't hers. Which is, I think, where I first learned that a ledger can be its own kind of religion, depending entirely on who's the one keeping it and who they've decided is worth keeping one for. I have one sibling, my brother Daniel, 2 years older than me. From the earliest thing I can remember, Daniel was the axis the whole house turned on. He got the bigger bedroom because he was still growing, a phrase that apparently applied to him until he was 17. He got a rented bounce house and a hired magician for his 9th birthday, while mine, 6 months later, got a sheet cake from the Kroger deli case and a card signed by everyone but written entirely in my mother's hand. When Daniel graduated high school, my parents bought him a used Honda Civic, paid in full so he'd have something reliable for college. When I graduated 2 years later, at the top of my class, I got a card with $40 in it and a note that said, "Proud of you, use it wisely." I bought a bus pass with it and told myself it didn't matter. None of this, taken on its own, would be enough to build a story around. Kids get treated differently in 1,000 small ways and mostly grow up fine. What actually mattered was the sentence underneath all of it, the one my mother said so often over the years that it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like weather, something you simply planned around. Daughters eventually leave anyway. Sons carry the name. I heard some version of it at Thanksgiving tables, at graduation parties, once, memorably, at my own bridal shower, delivered with such warmth that for years I told myself I had to be imagining the edge underneath it. I found my own edge early, and it looked nothing like Daniel's. Liked rules. I liked the specific, almost physical satisfaction of a form filled out correctly, a deadline hit with room to spare, a citation that actually matched the statute it claimed to. I was the kid who read the syllabus on the first day of class while everyone else was still finding a seat, the one who alphabetized her own class notes without being asked. That instinct is the entire reason any of what follows makes sense, because it eventually became a law degree, paid for mostly by my own loans and 2 years of night classes while I worked days at a small compliance shop downstate, and the law degree became a specialty most people outside a hospital's back office have never even heard of: healthcare regulatory compliance. I read licensing statutes the way other people read novels, for the plot, for the specific place where one clause quietly contradicts another 3 pages later. It is not a personality flaw, whatever my mother implied about it over the years, calling me intense the way other mothers say difficult. It is, it turns out, a very specific and very useful skill, and 8 years later it would turn out to be the only skill in that entire family that anyone could actually rely on. The one person in Belhaven who noticed that skill before it had a name was my father's older sister, my Aunt Ro. Rosalind Callahan Hutchins, a retired school nurse who lived 4 blocks from my parents in a house with a porch swing that needed oil and never got it because she said the creak reminded her which chair was hers. Aunt Ro drove me 2 hours each way to sit my LSAT because my parents had a thing at Daniel's church small group that same morning, something about a men's retreat planning committee that could not, apparently, be rescheduled around their own daughter's exam. Aunt Ro packed me a lunch for the drive back, a foil-wrapped sandwich and a thermos of coffee, and told me on the way home that she didn't care what score came back, she already knew I'd earned it twice over. Aunt Ro sat in the 3rd row at my bar exam swearing, and 3 years later with a bouquet of gas station carnations, because my parents had a thing that weekend too, which I'll get to, and because she always said good flowers were wasted on people too distracted to enjoy them slowly. I remember one specific afternoon from when I was 15, mostly because I still have the ribbon. I'd won first place in the regional science fair for a water quality project I'd spent 3 months on, testing runoff from the co-op's grain silos into the creek behind our house. My father had a shift that day. My mother had a booster club meeting for Daniel's baseball team, the kind of meeting she never once missed in 4 years. Aunt Ro drove out from Belhaven in her own car to sit through 2 hours of middle school science projects, so that somebody from my family would be in the gymnasium when they called my name, and she took me to the wagon wheel afterward and let me order whatever I wanted off the menu, including the milkshake my mother usually said was too expensive for a Tuesday. I still have that blue ribbon in a drawer. Daniel's baseball trophies from that same season sit, to this day, on a shelf in my parents' living room, dusted every week. The rupture, the one that set everything else in motion, happened years later. At a dinner in the spring I turned 24, only weeks after I'd passed the bar and started my first job at a regulatory compliance firm 2 hours south of Belhaven. My parents called a family dinner on a Sunday, the kind with the good tablecloth out and extra folding chairs pulled in from the garage, and I assumed, for about 40 minutes, that it was for me, that this was finally the celebration I'd quietly hoped for since the results came back. I was wrong. My mother stood at the head of the table, tapped her water glass with a fork the way she did before hymn announcements, and told the room, with the particular brightness she saved for church, that she and my father had liquidated $180,000 of their retirement savings to buy Daniel a building on Route 9 and open him a family medicine clinic. 31 years of scale house paychecks, converted into a down payment and a build-out budget, so that Daniel, who had just finished his residency in family medicine, could be a clinic owner instead of somebody's employee. I asked, as calmly as I could manage with my heart going, whether I'd be involved in any capacity, since I was, after all, the one person at that table who actually understood the regulatory side of opening a medical practice. My mother's answer is the sentence this entire story turns on, and I want you to hear it exactly the way she said it because later, in a room she never expected to be summoned into, I am going to say it back to her, word for word. Daughters eventually leave anyway. Sons carry the name. This is Daniel's. The relatives at that table, half of whom I hadn't even known, were invited, actually applauded, forks tapping glasses in a little round of celebration for a decision I'd found out about 90 seconds earlier. My cousin Deb found me afterward in the kitchen, rinsing a casserole dish she hadn't offered to bring, and told me I looked disappointed and that it wasn't a good look at a celebration. Selfish, she called it, quietly, the way people say the ugly word so they can pretend later they never really said it. Here's the part the toast that night left out entirely. 2 weeks after that dinner, my mother called not to apologize, not even to acknowledge what she'd said, but to ask if I could just take a look at the paperwork for the clinic, because the county and the state both required documentation nobody else in the family understood, and the contractor's timeline depended on it moving fast. I did it. I want to be honest with you about why. Because it's the part of myself I find hardest to explain even now, 8 years later. It wasn't really for Daniel, and it wasn't even really for them. It was because I was 24 years old and some stubborn, hopeful, not yet broken part of me still believed being useful and being valued were the same thing, and I hadn't finished unlearning that yet. It would take me 8 more years to finish the job, If you've ever done the actual work while someone else's name ended up on the door, I want you to say so in the comments, because what happens next only makes sense once you already know that feeling in your bones, the specific exhaustion of being indispensable and invisible at exactly the same time. And if this story is landing so far, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because it only gets more interesting from here. Year 1, I filed the Certificate of Need, the Outpatient Facility Licensing Application, the CLIA waiver for in-house lab testing, the DEA registration, and the state's medical facility inspection request, all under deadline, all correct on the first submission, all completely unpaid, because you're already so good at this stuff, honey, and we really can't afford a real lawyer right now. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only language I've ever fully trusted. I filed 11 separate documents that spring, across 3 different state agencies, in a window of 42 days, most of it done at my own kitchen table after 10-hour days at a firm that was already asking a great deal of a first-year associate. I know it was 42 days because I counted, the way I count nearly everything, a habit that used to embarrass me at dinner parties and that I now understand is simply how I keep myself honest when nobody else in the room is offering to. One of those 11 documents matters more than the rest, so I want you to remember it. Ohio requires certain outpatient medical facilities, especially ones running in-house diagnostic testing, to keep a named, licensed compliance officer of record on file with the state, a specific person legally responsible for the facility's ongoing regulatory standing. Daniel hadn't yet completed the additional certification the state required for that role. The build-out, meanwhile, was already moving, with penalty clauses baked into the contractor's schedule for every week of delay. So I did what any reasonably competent, reasonably naive 24-year-old with a brand new bar card and a family leaning on her would do. I listed myself, Nora J. Callahan, Esquire, Compliance Officer of Record, with the clear, spoken understanding, repeated twice over the phone with my mother at that same kitchen table, that once Daniel finished his own certification 18 months later, we would file the amendment and transfer the role to him. I wrote myself a note about it in a black 3-ring binder I'd started keeping that spring, tabbed by agency, color-coded the way I color-code every client file I've ever managed, because that is what a person learns to do once she's been burned enough times by other people's disorganization. I flagged that page. Amend upon Daniel's certification. Do not forget. I never did forget. I want that on the record because it's the whole point of this story. That same spring, 3 weeks after the CLIA waiver went in, the county sent back a deficiency notice on the facility's floor plan, a technical zoning issue nobody but a specialist would have caught in time. I remember the exact date because it landed the same week as my own firm's biggest deadline of the quarter, and I spent 2 nights at my kitchen table redrafting the facility diagram myself, cross-referencing it against the fire code, because the architect Daniel had hired hadn't built a medical facility before and didn't know which distances actually mattered. I emailed the corrected diagram to the county at 1040 in the morning. I noted the time in the binder, the way I noted everything, and I never once mentioned it to Daniel, because by then I had already learned that pointing out what I'd done rarely changed what happened next, and it usually just made the next ask arrive a little more casually than the one before it. Year 2, Daniel's clinic opened. There was a ribbon cutting with the mayor of Belhaven, a write-up in the county paper, and a photograph of Daniel in a crisp white coat holding a pair of oversized novelty scissors he bought specifically for the occasion. I was not in that photograph. I was not at that ribbon cutting. I had a deposition scheduled 2 hours south that same morning, and it had not occurred to anyone to check with me before setting the date, because it had not occurred to anyone that my calendar was a thing worth checking. Aunt Ro went, though, standing near the back in her good coat, and she called me that evening, unprompted, and told me the clinic looked wonderful, and that she'd made a point, twice, of telling people at the reception exactly whose signature was on the licensing paperwork that made the whole building legal in the first place. Somebody ought to say it, she told me on the phone, since nobody up there was going to. I also passed a major certification exam that same month, one that took most of my colleagues 2 attempts to clear. I told my parents about it in a voicemail. They never called back. I noted it in the binder anyway, in the margin, a small habit that had nothing to do with anyone but me. Year 3, I made my swearing in for full bar membership on a cold, bright Saturday morning in April. My parents did not attend. They were, that same weekend, at Daniel's 1-year clinic anniversary open house, an event that featured, notably, a bounce house for the neighborhood kids and a banner reading 1 year strong stretched across the front window. An almost exact echo of the 9th birthday I still remembered from 20 years earlier. Aunt Rose sat in the third row of the county courthouse with gas station carnations wrapped in that thin cellophane that always smells faintly of the cooler they'd been stored in. And afterward, she took me to the wagon wheel for the meatloaf special and told me, in her flat, unsentimental way, that she was prouder of me that morning than she'd ever managed to say out loud to Daniel about anything in his entire life, and that this was a fact she intended to correct before she died. If any part of this year-by-year accounting feels like your own family's calendar, the one where the same events always seem to conflict and it was always your event that lost, I want to hear it. Comment where you're watching from tonight and what year you're still adding items to in your own private tally. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the family is about to find out exactly who I'd become without them, and I promise you it doesn't go the way they expected. Between years 3 and 4, the clinic failed its first routine state inspection on a documentation technicality, a missing log for a piece of lab equipment that needed weekly calibration records. Daniel called me at 9 at night, panicked, saying the state had given him 2 weeks to correct it or face a citation. I drove up that Saturday, unpaid, and spent 4 hours building him a calibration log template and walking his one part-time medical assistant through how to fill it out correctly going forward. My mother stopped by partway through, saw me at the break room table with my laptop and a stack of equipment manuals, and told me it was so nice that I had a hobby that actually helped people. I wrote that sentence down in the binder too, verbatim, the same night, because even then some part of me suspected I would need it eventually. Year 4, David and I got married. We had a small wedding, 60 guests, at a restored barn 40 minutes outside Belhaven, because that was both what we could afford and, honestly, what we actually wanted. My mother forgot to mention it at church the Sunday before, in a conversation with the same women she saw every week for 30 years. She did not forget to mention, in that same conversation, that Daniel's clinic was expanding into a second exam room and adding a part-time nurse practitioner, a detail she shared with the kind of enthusiasm most mothers reserve for grandchildren. My father, at the last minute, said he needed to check on something with Daniel's staffing situation and arrived 11 minutes into the ceremony, slipping into a back pew while the officiant was still mid-sentence. Aunt Ro walked partway down the aisle with me in his place, gripping my arm a little too tightly, whispering that she'd never once in her life been late to something that mattered and didn't intend to start getting forgiven for other people's habits. I counted those 11 minutes standing at the end of a barn aisle in a dress I'd altered myself with a seam ripper and a YouTube tutorial, watching the door, telling myself it didn't matter, the way I'd been telling myself that for 24 years by then. Year 5, David and I bought our first house, a small brick 2-bedroom with a leaning maple tree out front that we both loved immediately, and for no defensible reason beyond the shade it threw across the porch every August. My parents visited exactly once that year, stayed 40 minutes, and spent 30 of those minutes on a phone call with Daniel about a billing software glitch at the clinic. My mother pacing the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, while David and I sat at our own table waiting for the visit to actually begin. Around that same time, quietly, in the part of my life nobody in Belhaven was paying attention to, I made partner at my firm, the youngest compliance partner in its history, after leading a facility-wide audit that saved a client hospital system from a 7-figure federal penalty, a case that took me 4 months, 18 site visits, and 1 memorable week living out of a hotel 2 states away while I rebuilt an entire hospital's documentation trail from scratch. The managing partner took me to dinner to celebrate and told me, in front of 2 other senior attorneys, that my name was the first one clients asked for by now when a facility was in real trouble. I remember sitting in that restaurant thinking about the ribbon cutting 8 years earlier, the one I'd missed for a deposition nobody had thought to reschedule, and understanding for the first time that the 2 versions of my life, the one at home and the one everywhere else, had simply stopped touching each other entirely. I did not call home to announce any of it. I had learned, somewhere in those 5 years, to stop expecting anyone there to ask. Year 6, I sent Daniel a routine reminder email, the kind of email I send dozens of clients every single year without a second thought, flagging that his compliance certification, the one we had always planned to swap onto the state filing, was now finally complete, and that we should file the amendment transferring the compliance officer role from me to him before the clinic's license renewal came up the following spring. I still have that email. I have every email I have ever sent that family about that clinic, dated, filed, backed up on 2 separate drives, because old habits from a person who learned young that verbal promises in that house had a way of evaporating by morning. Daniel replied with 4 words. Yeah, I'll get to it. He did not get to it. I flagged it once more the following January, politely, professionally, CCing no one, and then I let it go. Because by year 6 I had learned that reminding this family of anything a second time rarely changed the outcome, and mostly just cost me another piece of the patience I was trying to save for people who'd actually earned it. Somewhere in that same stretch, Daniel and Caitlin had their daughter, my niece Ellie, and for about a year I let myself hope that a baby in the family might soften something, might pull me back into whatever inner circle I'd been standing outside of since I was 9 years old. I drove up for her baptism, brought a gift I'd spent real time choosing, and stood in the back of the church hall afterward while my mother introduced Ellie to relatives as Daniel's daughter, the clinic's newest patient, laughing at her own joke, without once mentioning that the aunt standing 3 feet away was the reason that clinic had a license to see patients at all. Caitlin was kind to me that day, kinder than most of the family ever bothered to be, and for a while I thought that kindness might turn into something real between us. It never quite did. She was, I came to understand slowly, loyal to the family's version of things in the specific way people become loyal to a story once they've married into it, whether or not they'd have chosen it themselves. Year 7, Aunt Ro had a small stroke. She recovered well, but I drove up every other weekend for 2 full months to sit with her, manage her follow-up appointments, and cross-reference her discharge paperwork against her insurance the way I'd cross-reference any client's file. Because it turns out love and competence aren't actually different languages, they're just the same one spoken at different volumes. I sat with her through 3 separate physical therapy appointments and learned, alongside her, how to work the new blood pressure cuff her doctor recommended. My parents visited her twice in that same window. Both visits, conveniently, doubled as a stop to check on the clinic afterward, since Aunt Ro's house sat exactly 7 minutes from Daniel's parking lot. She never once complained about that to me. She just mentioned it, the way she mentioned everything, once, flatly, and let me draw my own conclusions, the same way she'd let me draw my own conclusions about most things in that family since I was old enough to notice a pattern. One evening that summer, sitting on her porch while the swing creaked under both of us, she told me she'd started keeping her own kind of ledger too. Nothing formal, just a small spiral notebook on her nightstand where she wrote down who'd actually shown up that week and who'd only called. "You come by it honestly," she said, tapping the notebook against her knee. "Watching you keep records your whole life taught me it's not a cold thing to do. It's just refusing to let anyone rewrite what actually happened." I didn't know, sitting there, how much I'd end up needing that particular permission a year later. By year 8, I had mostly stopped expecting anything different from them, and something happens to a person when they finally stop expecting. It doesn't make you bitter, or at least it hadn't made me bitter yet. It makes you accurate. I stopped narrating my own life to my parents, because they weren't asking, and in the quiet that left behind, I built something real of my own, a marriage, a career I was proud of, a small, warm rhythm of Sunday dinners with David and Aunt Ro that had nothing to do with anyone's permission. And somewhere in that same quiet, entirely without my family noticing, the County Bar Association ran a feature on regional compliance attorneys under 40, and my photograph led the piece, above a headline about the hospital audit from the year before. A woman from Trinity Lutheran's Tuesday prayer group, who happened to be my mother's second cousin by marriage, saw it on her kitchen table one morning and mentioned it, almost as an aside, to my mother at choir practice that same week. "Wasn't that your Nora in the paper? Regulatory law," it said. "Sounds important, whatever it is." That is how my parents finally learned, 8 years too late, that the daughter who eventually leaves anyway had quietly built exactly the kind of professional stand-in you'd want on your side if something ever went badly wrong with the medical facility's paperwork. I heard about the actual moment secondhand, from Aunt Ro, who heard it from a neighbor who'd been standing close enough at choir practice to watch my mother's face when the cousin mentioned the article. According to Aunt Ro, my mother went quiet for a beat, asked to see the clipping, folded it carefully into her purse, and said nothing else about it for the rest of practice. She did not call me that week. She did not call me the week after that either. It would be another 4 months and 1 letter from the Ohio State Medical Board before the article and the daughter in it became something worth walking into my office for. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because this next part is where the story turns. If you've ever watched someone in your own life go quiet instead of proud when they realized you'd succeeded without them, I need you to know that quiet is information too. Comment below if you felt that particular silence, and subscribe if you want to see exactly what I did once I understood what it meant. I did not learn about the medical board's letter from my parents. I learned about it the way I learn most things that actually matter in that family, sideways, by accident, through a door somebody forgot to close. My sister-in-law Caitlin, Daniel's wife, left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter at their daughter's birthday dinner, and I happened to be reaching past it for a stack of napkins when a thread lit up on the screen, the family group chat, the one I have never once been added to in 8 years despite asking, gently, twice. I wasn't trying to read it. I want to be honest with you about that because it would be easy, telling this story, to make that moment sound more deliberate than it actually was. But I read it anyway. 3 lines, fully visible without unlocking a thing, my mother's name at the top of the thread. Make a list before we go over there. Be specific about exactly what we need her to do. She's a lawyer, she'll know how to talk to the board better than any of us would. Don't lead with the money part. Just say it's a family thing and see what she says first. I set the phone back down precisely where it had been, walked back to the table, ate a piece of birthday cake I genuinely could not tell you the flavor of afterward, and drove home in complete silence, hands at 10 and 2 the entire 40 minutes, which is not how I normally drive, and which David noticed the second I walked in the door without saying a single word about the cake or the party or anything at all. I want to tell you what those 3 lines actually did to me, because it wasn't the anger you might expect. It was closer to relief. The specific, unpleasant relief of finally having proof for something you'd spent years being told you were imagining. I had spent 8 years being called selfish for noticing a pattern, and here was the pattern, typed out in my mother's own words, planning its approach to me the way you'd plan an approach to a difficult client, rather than a daughter. I didn't cry in the car. I want to be honest about that too, because it would make for a tidier story if I had. I just drove and counted the streetlights between the restaurant and our house, 41 of them, because counting things has always been how I keep my hands from shaking when the rest of me wants to. That night I did not confront anyone, and I did not text anyone. I sat down at my desk with the black 3-ring binder, retired to a shelf for years but never once thrown away, and I pulled up the state's online licensing portal instead, the way I would for any other file that needed checking before I made a single move. I typed in the clinic's facility license number. I already knew what I'd find, but I wanted to see it in writing, official, time-stamped. There it was, unchanged for 8 years straight through 8 separate renewal cycles, designated compliance officer of record, Nora J. By Callahan, Esquire, not Daniel's name, mine, never amended, despite the flag in the binder, despite 2 written reminders, despite 8 full years during which not one of those renewals had involved so much as a phone call, asking whether I was still willing to carry it. The next morning, I called a former colleague, a healthcare regulatory attorney named Priya, who now consults on facility compliance full-time, not to plot anything, but to confirm something much simpler than revenge. What exactly was I still legally exposed to, and what, precisely, was I entitled to do about it? She pulled the statute up while we were on the phone and read it back to me the way she'd read it back to any client, flat and unemotional. As the named officer, you're the one holding the bag if there's ever a real finding against that facility, she said. You know that. I told her I did and that I'd known it, technically, since the day I signed it. She also told me, and this is the part that actually mattered most, that I had every legal right to formally withdraw my name from that filing at any time, for any reason, with proper notice to the state, and that most people in my position would have done it years ago. This isn't revenge, she said, before I'd even said the word out loud. This is just you finally reading your own contract. I asked her, half joking, whether she thought I was overreacting, whether 8 years of unpaid filings and a group chat I wasn't in really added up to anything a court or an ethics board would care about. She didn't laugh. Nora, I've seen attorneys get disciplined for exposures a fraction of this size, she said. You've been carrying regulatory liability for a facility you don't run, don't get paid by, and don't get consulted about for 8 years because your family assumed you always would. That's not devotion. That's just an unpriced risk with your name stapled to it. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. 3 weeks before my parents sat down across from me at my own conference table, I filed that withdrawal. I told no one. I sent the state the exact correct form, the same kind of form I filed 1,000 times for 100 other clients, and the state, following its own required process to the letter, sent the clinic a notice that its license was now out of compliance with the named officer requirement, with 30 days to designate a properly certified replacement or face suspension. That was the letter my mother slid across my conference table, calling it, gently, just paperwork. Stay with me here, because what happened in that conference room is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Subscribe now if you haven't, because I don't want you walking into this next part cold. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, all 3 of them together, my mother, my father, and Daniel, which told me before anyone said a single word exactly how seriously they'd finally decided to take this. My mother wore her good church coat, the same one she'd worn to my swearing in 8 years earlier and every anniversary since. Daniel wore scrubs, as though he'd been pulled straight out of an emergency, though I knew for a fact his first patient wasn't until 11. He also, I noticed, was carrying a single folded sheet of paper in his jacket pocket, the corner of it visible the whole meeting, which I later learned was exactly the list Caitlin's group chat had promised. My father hung back near the glass door the way he always did in rooms he already suspected he was about to be in the wrong in. My assistant, Marisol, brought in a tray of water glasses without my asking, and she gave my mother a warm professional nod on her way out, the kind of small, ordinary decency my own family had never once extended to strangers in front of me, and it struck me, even in that moment, how strange it was that I'd have to notice it. Marisol paused at the door for a second longer than she needed to, caught my eye, and asked quietly whether I wanted her to hold my 10 o'clock. I told her yes, and she closed the door behind her without another word, and something about that small, competent exchange, the kind I have with people every single day at work, steadied me more than I expected it to, walking into a room with my own parents in it. I had chosen the setting on purpose. Not a diner, not the house I grew up in, not even a neutral coffee shop where they could control the volume of the room. My own conference table, on my own floor, my own name etched into the glass beside the elevator bank downstairs where they'd walked past it to get to me. My mother opened, as I knew she would, with the same warmth she'd used at that dinner 8 years earlier, the particular brightness that has spent a lifetime learning how to disguise a demand as a favor. "We need you to make this go away," she said, sliding the folder across the table toward me. "You know people? You can fix this, right? It's just paperwork." Daniel pulled the folded list from his pocket and set it beside her folder, unopened, as if its presence alone should settle things. "The clinic can't afford a shutdown," he said, arms crossed over his scrubs. "Patients depend on it? This is not the time to make a point." I opened the folder they brought and set it down beside a folder of my own, my copy of the original binder page, laminated now, the sticky flag from year 1 still visible under the plastic like a fossil. In the same flat procedural voice I use when I walk a board of directors through a compliance timeline, I told them I had filed the original compliance officer designation 8 years earlier, at their request, without payment, with a written note in my own file that it was meant to be temporary. I told them I had reminded Daniel twice, in writing, to file the amendment once he was certified. I told them the clinic had renewed its license 8 separate times on the strength of a compliance officer who had not once, in nearly a decade, been consulted, updated, or compensated. And I told them, finally, calmly, that 3 weeks earlier, I had exercised my legal right to withdraw my name from that filing, not as an attack on the clinic, but as the closing of an exposure I never should have been carrying that long in the first place. Daniel cut back in before my mother could respond, unfolding his list a second time and reading off it. "We need you to call the board today. Tell them it was a clerical error. Tell them you're refiling right now, this afternoon." I told him, in the same flat voice, that I wasn't going to do that, because it wasn't a clerical error. It was 8 years of a filing nobody had bothered to maintain, and I wasn't willing to put my own bar license behind a statement that wasn't true. "You'd let the whole thing collapse over wording," he said, and I told him that wording was the entire profession I'd spent a decade building, and that he of all people, having leaned on that profession for free for 8 years, should understand exactly what it was worth. For maybe 4 seconds, my mother's face did something I had never once seen it do in 32 years. The church coat brightness dropped away entirely, and what was underneath it was fear, plain and completely unrehearsed. "You knew this whole time," she said, not as an accusation so much as a fact she was hearing herself say out loud for the first time. "Your name has been on it this whole time, and you knew." I told her I'd known since the day I filed it, because that is what it means to be the person who actually reads the form before she signs it. For those 4 seconds, she looked, for the first time in my adult life, like someone who understood exactly what her family had been quietly built on top of for 8 years. Then she tried a different angle, softer, her voice dropping the way it used to when she wanted something from my father. "Think of your aunt," she said. "Think how disappointed Rosalind would be, watching this family fall apart over a form." I told her, evenly, that Aunt Ro had known about that form for 6 years, longer than anyone else at the table, and that she'd never once suggested I owed anybody silence about it. She tried once more after that, reaching into her purse and setting a folded check on the table, blank except for her signature, sliding it toward me the way she'd slid the letter an hour earlier. "If it's about money, we can figure something out," she said. "We can pay you for the years, if that's what this is." I looked at that check for a long moment, because I wanted her to watch me actually consider it and reject it, rather than waving it away too quickly for her to understand what she'd just offered. "This was never about money," I told her. "If it were, you could have paid me at any point in the last 8 years and I'd have taken it. You didn't, because it never once occurred to you that the work had a price. I'm not going to let you assign it one now, backdated, just to make this conversation easier." I slid the check back across the table, unsigned by me, and left it sitting between us. That seemed to be the moment my mother finally understood there was no version of this conversation where she still held the leverage, and she straightened her shoulders, folding the fear right back into offense the way she always did. "We are still your family," she said. "Family takes care of family." I let that sentence sit in the room a moment before I answered it, because I wanted her to hear it the way I had heard it my entire life, warm on the surface, hollow underneath the moment you actually pressed on it. "You told me, at the dinner where you announced the clinic, that daughters eventually leave anyway and sons carry the name," I said. "I didn't leave. I withdrew. There's a difference, and you taught it to me yourself, 8 years ago, at that same table." My father, still standing near the door, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something closer to breath-catching. Daniel unfolded his list at last, waving it slightly, and started in about lawsuits and reputational damage and what this would look like at church, and he kept talking, louder than I ever once raised my own voice, while I sat with both hands flat on the table and let him finish. That was, I think, the entire shape of the last 8 years compressed into one room. Him filling the space with volume, me filling a folder with facts, and only one of those two things ever holding up under an actual state inspection. My mother looked at my father then, waiting, I think, for him to back her up the way he'd backed her up at that dinner 8 years earlier, the way he'd backed her up at nearly every family decision since I was old enough to notice a pattern in it. He didn't. He stood by the door with his hands in his pockets and said nothing at all, and I watched my mother register his silence as its own kind of answer, her jaw tightening in a way I recognized from 100 Sunday dinners where she'd realized, partway through, that she was arguing alone. David had come in quietly a few minutes earlier and stood near the window, arms loosely crossed, saying nothing at all, and his presence alone did more to steady that room than anything I could have said out loud. When Daniel finally ran out of words, David spoke for the first time, just one line, quiet and even. "She's not the one who let this go for 8 years. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. I told them the clinic could resolve this exactly the way any facility resolves it, by designating a new, properly certified compliance officer through the state's normal process, something Daniel was now, finally, fully qualified to do himself. I told them I would not be refiling under my own name, not out of spite, but because I was not going to spend a 9th year professionally responsible for a building I had no voice in, no stake in, and no seat at, beyond the one they had assigned me 8 years ago without ever once asking. And I told my mother, plainly, without any performance in it, that I would genuinely welcome a real relationship with this family again, but that it would have to start with her being able to say out loud in that exact room that what she said at that dinner 8 years ago was wrong, not just inconvenient in hindsight. She did not say it. She did not say it. She picked up her folder, told me she never thought I'd let strangers watch my own brother's business fail, and left without looking back at any of us. Daniel followed her out, still talking, his list still in his hand, unread. My father stayed behind for almost a full minute after the door had shut, looking down at the laminated binder page still sitting on my table, before he finally said, quietly, almost to himself, "I should have asked whose name was on that form before I ever let your brother pick up a pen." Then he left too, and the room went very still, the way rooms do after something has finally, actually ended. Marisol knocked once, gently, to ask if I still wanted my 10 o'clock pushed, and I told her no. I'd take it after all, because there is a specific kind of relief in returning to work that makes sense, work with clear rules and clean deadlines, after an hour spent in a room where the rules had never once been clear or clean. David stayed another few minutes, standing where he'd been the whole time, and when I finally looked over at him, he just said, "You did that exactly the way you would have wanted to 8 years ago if anyone had asked you how." I hadn't realized, until he said it, how much I'd needed somebody to notice that. 3 months passed before anyone from that family reached out again, and it was not my mother. It was my father, on a Sunday evening, asking if he could come by alone, no agenda, nothing he needed from me. He sat at our kitchen table, the one David built himself out of reclaimed barnwood, and told me, without being asked, that he'd spent 31 years at the scale house learning to trust a number stamped on a ticket over anything a person simply told him, and that somewhere along the way he'd stopped applying that same standard at home, where it mattered most. It wasn't a full apology. It was smaller than that, and somehow more honest for being smaller. I told him we could start slow, dinner once a month, no mention of the clinic, no requests attached to it. He agreed, and in the months since, he's kept to it, showing up on time now, every time, as if that small, specific correction were the only apology he actually knew how to make. Daniel called once in September, not to apologize either, but to ask, almost carefully, whether I'd be willing to look over the clinic's new compliance officer paperwork, just to make sure it's done right this time. I told him no, that Priya's firm did that kind of work now and could recommend someone at their standard rate, and that this particular door was closed for good. He was quiet for a second, then said, "Yeah, fair. And there was a pause after that where I genuinely thought he might say something more, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything with actual weight to it. He didn't. He asked instead whether Ellie could still call me for her school project on jobs that help people, and I told him of course she could because whatever was closed between Daniel and me, it wasn't going to be my niece's door too. That was the end of the call. It wasn't warm. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was, at least, the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in 8 years, and I've learned to let a sentence like that be exactly as small as it actually is, without dressing it up into something bigger. My mother has not called. Daniel found a new, properly certified compliance officer within the state's required window, which I confirmed the same way I confirm everything, through the public portal, out of nothing more than professional habit rather than any lingering concern. The clinic stayed open. I want to be honest that I never once wanted it closed. I only ever wanted my own name off a form I never should have been carrying alone for 8 years in the first place. Aunt Rose's reaction, when I finally told her the whole thing over coffee the following week, was the one I'd been waiting for without admitting it to myself. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which for her is its own kind of statement, and when I finished she reached over and tapped the edge of the table twice, the way she does when she wants you to know she's about to say something she means completely. 8 years, she said. You carried that whole family's paperwork for 8 years and never once asked them to carry anything back. I hope you know that was never something you owed anybody. I told her I was still figuring out what I did and didn't owe this family, and she said that was probably the most honest thing I'd said all year, and then she changed the subject to whether I'd tried her new rhubarb recipe yet, because she has never been a person who lingers in a hard conversation longer than it needs. These days, most Sundays, David and Aunt Ro and I sit down to dinner at 6,030, the same time, mostly the same handful of dishes on rotation, because Aunt Ro insists a good ritual never needs improving, only keeping. The black binder sits on a shelf in my home office now, fully retired, its spine slightly bent from 8 years of being opened and closed at kitchen tables that were never quite mine. Sometimes David catches me glancing at it while I'm working on something unrelated, and he doesn't ask what I'm thinking about because by now he already knows. I kept it, not as a trophy, as a reminder that I was never actually looking for a fight, only for the one thing this family had never once thought to give me freely, an acknowledgement, in writing or otherwise, that the work I did was seen. Ellie comes over some Saturdays now, with Daniel dropping her off and picking her up without lingering, and she likes to sit at my desk and do lawyer work, with a legal pad and a pen almost bigger than her hand. And I let her, because there is something quietly healing about watching a 9-year-old take documentation seriously for no reason other than that it looks important to her aunt. My father comes to dinner on the first Sunday of every month exactly as agreed, and he's started bringing a small dessert from the wagon wheel each time, unasked, as if he's decided that showing up consistently is a language he can finally speak fluently, even if the words themselves still come slowly. He asked me once, over pie, whether I still had the binder, and when I told him yes, he nodded slowly and said he was glad, because some things in a family ought to stay written down somewhere, even after everyone's finished arguing about them. Aunt Rose still calls every Sunday afternoon before we sit down to eat. Same time, same 10-minute check-in, and she still signs off every call the exact same way she has for 32 years, telling me to eat something green and to call her if anyone ever tries to hand me a form again without explaining what it's for. That's my story. 8 years, 11 original filings, and one single line on one form that nobody thought to ask me about until it was the only thing standing between them and a shutdown. I think about that binder sometimes, sitting up there on its shelf, and I think about all the years I told myself that keeping it meant I was still holding on to something bitter. I don't think that anymore. I think keeping records was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about making sure that if the day ever came when I needed to be believed, I wouldn't have to rely on anyone's memory but my own, least of all theirs. If there's a lesson in it, it's this. Being useful to the people you love is not the same as being valued by them, and you are allowed to find that out on your own timeline, not theirs, and to close the file whenever you decide it's finally time, whether that's after 8 years or 8 months. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the boundary itself, only, if you're generous, the paperwork to back it up. If someone in your life only came looking for you once your name turned out to be worth something, I want to hear about it, so tell me in the comments below where you're watching from, and if this story meant something to you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.